Heads, thank you for your wisdom, Lord, in conducting city business tonight. Allow us to do work that is pleasing to you. Thank you for my fellow commissioners and your blessings upon them. Thank you for city staff that they continue to do the work that you expect. Thank you for those visiting. Thank you for our soldiers, and protect them as they are being sent into harm's way. In your name, amen.
Amen. Please join me.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Another roll call, please.
Commissioners Diana Cook.
Present.
Commissioner Coronado. Absent. Harvey. Absent. Molly.
Here.
Tarciano.
Here.
Vice Chair Randy Hall.
Here.
Chairman James Vose.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. There does not appear to be any speakers or any audience for that matter. So we'll forego the announcement on speakers tonight. However, if any decide to join us this evening, I'll reiterate the requirement for speakers. Tonight, our business consists of consent calendar, which is the approval of the minutes of the regular meeting of September 22nd, 2014. May I have a motion, please?
I move to accept the minutes of September 22nd, 2014.
Second that? Thank you. Questions or comments? Please vote.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. In new business this evening, we're going to hear a briefing regarding complete streets from our director, Mr. Ludicky. Brian, the mic doesn't seem to be on.
To be on?
Try it again.
Is it there now?
It's there now.
Oh, I can shout. I'm good at that too. This is a presentation that I presented to the City Council several weeks ago, and it's very timely because the city has been granted funding to do a complete streets master plan for the community. This is going to be administered through the Southern California Association of Governments, and complete streets are a legal requirement that is becoming more and more important as we move forward on looking at funding for city projects, particularly transportation projects. The state of California actually back in 2008 adopted a requirement that the next time a city does a significant change into its general plan, it needs to incorporate complete streets policies into that plan. That is one of the things that we're going to be doing as a part of this master plan of complete streets, and so you as a commission are obviously going to see those and have involvement in it. At the same time, as I mentioned, federal and state agencies, Metropolitan Transportation Group for the County of Los Angeles, for example, and Caltrans, both are now requiring that complete streets efforts be a part of any project that they look to fund. And so I guess given that, and given where the legal situation is headed, we should ask, what are complete streets? And the answer, unfortunately, is that there's no single simple answer to that. We could look at these two examples, the left one out of Burbank and the right one out of Torrance, and say, are they complete streets? And the best answer that we can really give at this point is that we don't know. We don't know enough about what's going on at these particular locations to know whether or not they are in fact complete streets. Complete streets, based on the definition, really are streets that are designed for all the expected users of that street. In some cases, that may include pedestrians, bicyclists, transit, things of that type. We certainly know, for instance, that the boulevard redesign that we did is a complete street. It provides very good transportation options for all of the expected users that we have downtown. And it does that through its design and the balancing of those needs. But as we kind of look a little closer, we're not certain, what's a complete street. Something that may not look like it's a complete street at the outset. This happens to be a street in Fort Collins, Colorado. May in fact be one. Now, this street obviously accommodates vehicles, a bicyclist, pedestrians, and the occasional freight train that runs down the middle of it. Now, we may not think that that's a great thing to have happen, but in doing a little bit of research, this particular location in Fort Collins has had this train track in place for a long time. They seem to have adjusted to it. The person on the bicycle seems to be doing okay with freight trains that don't move any more than 15 miles an hour. At the same time, an example out of Florida, which has maybe some great features that we would normally want, may not be as complete a street as we would like. This particular one, which is out of Cape Coral, I believe, is an area that really is designed more for high speed on vehicles. They do have the walking path, but there's not a lot of people on it, and in doing a little bit of research, we found that there have actually been some pretty bad pedestrian vehicle collisions on this stretch of road, believe it or not, including, unfortunately, an 84-year-old woman who was hit in the crosswalk, not on the street itself, but on one of the side streets in which she was crossing. So, we really are looking over the last 40 to 50 years at roads and streets being designed with one sort of single metric in mind, and that's what's known as level of service. That single standard, which is also currently within our general plan, is actually being questioned to a great extent now within the engineering and design community. And the reason for that is because the reliance on it has had some really unintended and negative consequences. Most of us really have a pretty good idea of the concept of a road. Highways and freeways are pretty well understood by us. They're designed for high speeds. They're really designed to connect to somewhat distant locations. They tend to have limited access, and they're designed for a geometric approach that really allows for high speeds to occur. Think about your typical freeway. You don't have at-grade crossings. You really don't have traffic signals. You don't have direct access from the land uses along it. So that was really the original idea on roads, freeways, highways. And as the United States built these out, particularly in the post-World War II era, we got a lot of benefit out of those connections of those distant places. Streets, on the other hand, have a long history of really being designed to serve local land use. These may not come out as clear as I would like, but on the left is really Brainerd, Minnesota, and on the right is a picture of Lancaster Boulevard, back from some of the earlier days of the century. And they were really both, in these instances, streets that were designed to serve the immediate local land use that was along it. If you look closely, you see that modern-day traffic and engineering people and planners would love the fact they're multimodal. You have people on foot, you have people that are driving. And the street also acts as a platform for value. We'll get to that concept a little later. for the land uses that are along it. In other words, the street itself brings value to the property that's there. But what's happened over the last few decades is that with the best of intentions, we've actually created in many of our living environments kind of a hybrid, which is commonly termed now a stroad. It is a combination of street and road, which really tries to do two things at once and ends up not doing either one of them very well. It's a street that's often designed for high speed. Its geometrics allow high speed, but at the same time, it's got numerous intersections, numerous traffic signals, numerous driveways, and other things that limit the ability for people to actually go at high speed. Those things create delays, they create frustration, and they are really not only a street or transportation model that doesn't work well, it's also very dangerous, it's very expensive, they tend to have very high rates of collisions and high rates of injury collisions, and they also have the very bad effect in a local setting of repelling investment. This is kind of unusual because you do have some buildings that come up to the street in this particular one, but quite often these buildings get pushed way far back because nobody wants to be really close. One engineer that I follow pretty closely has described Stroads as the futon of transportation design, something that tries to do two things and ends up not doing either one of them very well. So Stroad, it actually is defined in the Urban Dictionary. The key things is that built for high speed but with multiple access points. This happens to be Soledad Canyon Road in Santa Clarita. It is a classic Stroad. Anyone who has driven along it or is familiar with it realizes that the one bit in the definition, which is it unsafe at any speed, is actually very true. It's unsafe to drive down. It's unsafe to try to pull off of. It's unsafe to try to pull onto. And if we think back to freeways, you have speeds on this street that approach freeway speeds. But those freeways don't have intersections, traffic signals, driveways. These do. And that's one of the real factors and things that we need to start looking at as a city, because we have our own Stroads. And those are really, if you start looking at where our collisions and other problems occur, these are the places that it's really the problem. So, using the level of service isn't adequate, and we want to make sure that as our design professionals really start looking at the way our streets ought to be designed, that they have the right tools and the proper ways that they can design our streets to meet needs. This skill exists in the engineering and design professions. It's just that they haven't been called forward in many cases because the focus of traffic engineering, as I said, over the past few decades, has been to move as many cars as fast as possible. And now that we've done that, we're really beginning to see some of the issues. So we believe that human behavior, which is fundamentally adaptable, can be affected by how we design our roadways. And these are really the four things that we want to look at as we go through our Complete Streets effort. We want to look at speed. We want to look at safety. Those two are very correlated. We want to look at connected networks of streets, and we want to look at the productivity that streets bring to the property along them, because it's a very big public investment. And there should be some opportunity for the city to recoup that investment in order to allow for the maintenance of those roadways and so forth. We already know from our work in our transportation planning for bicycles and pedestrians that high speed increases risk. If you are hit as a pedestrian at 40 miles an hour, you will likely die. If you are hit at 20 miles an hour, you may be injured, but you are not as likely to die. In fact, you're very unlikely to die, given the statistics. And if you look at the speeds around our roads, you'll see why this becomes a very, very important thing. Now, speed is a function of design. This particular graphic actually comes off the cover of a publication from the Federal Highway Administration. And what it does is it really calls forth that when you're driving down a street or a highway, there are embedded in that design a lot of different assumptions. Now, I'm not a traffic engineer, and I probably can't do a real good job of explaining to you what these different speeds are. But the most important one that I really want to bring to your attention is the operating speed. And the operating speed is defined as the speed that a motorist in good weather conditions on a street that's largely unimpeded, how fast will they typically drive? Operating speed may be faster, and often cases, and particularly in our area, is faster than what the posted speed limits are. Now, there's a downside to that I'll get to in a minute, but people are basically going to drive as fast as they perceive the street will allow them to drive, regardless of what the posted speed limit is. In fact, that same publication that this is in says posting lower speed limits has little effect on operating speed. And I think we can probably know this, particularly as we get more used to where we drive around. You may be more aware than many people, but many people I talk to don't even know exactly what the speed limits are on the sections of roads they travel in our community. They only know what they feel they can safely drive. So that's why design is so important. As a side note, and we're kind of going through this process right now, the city has to do speed surveys on a periodic basis, and it has to set speed limits based on how fast people drive. There's really no option under state law to do much different than that. There are areas and certain situations where the city can post speeds a little bit lower than what those operating speeds are, but the fact is, as we found, those signs and those restrictions have little effect on how fast people really drive. It's the design of the road that has to happen. Hans Monderman was a Dutch traffic engineer. He's unfortunately no longer with us, but he kind of pioneered the idea of shared space. And one of the counterintuitive things that he did was he found that all traffic engineering efforts to make roads safer in many cases made them less safe, because it made things more automatic for people when they drove. They didn't have to spend as much time thinking, looking, watching. They simply assumed that if they got on the road and followed all the rules, that everything was safe for them. So he has a number of great quotes, but this one I really like. He says, "Every road tells a story. It's just that so many of our roads tell the story poorly, or they tell the wrong story." And the fact is that if you have a badly designed street, there are consequences to that. I love this poster. If you need a sign to tell people to slow down on your street, then you designed your street wrong. That's just a fact of life. And that's what we have to start looking at as we go through our Complete Streets effort. If you don't do that, you may have neighbors that'll decide other ways to take this into their hands. I'm not advocating this, by the way, but it's an example of how frustrated people can get with a situation like this. So design matters. Look at these two streets as an example. Which one is the 25-mile-an-hour street? Yeah, they actually both are, but which one do you think is more likely to get people driving at a 25-mile-an-hour pace? The one on the right, by the way, is not in our city. That's in Denver, Colorado. The one on the left is in our city, and it's a typical street that's designed to our standards. But the fact is that design, width, do affect how fast people drive. There are some examples of places that have gone and redesigned so that they have changed the standards that they design their streets under. Oregon, which has a lot of different situations in it that are more favorable for this approach, is really a lot further ahead in some of this thought. This is out of Bend, Oregon. You can see the way that the street patterns are designed and the street widths are designed to make this a slower type environment. Now, the reason Oregon gets a little bit more flexibility at the local level to do this is that the state of Oregon has put local agencies in charge of street design, as opposed to fire code being in charge of street design. Now, I have nothing against fire departments and they're needing access, but what's happened in Oregon is that Oregon has said, you, local agency, will work with the fire provider, and instead of a blanket standard, we'll go ahead and make sure that you are able to design streets that actually meet the needs of your community. So you can also have commercial complete streets. This one, you can go down and take a look at this. This has some similarities to our boulevard. This is actually Montrose on the north side of Glendale, for those of you who are familiar with that area, Honolulu Avenue. This is once again out of Fort Collins, and I included this one because this street width is actually 120 feet. That's the same width as our so-called peripheral loop around the city. But you can see that the design of the street creates a far different environment for driving than does the peripheral loop designs that the city uses. You can do transit in complete streets. We really do, I don't usually use Las Vegas as a great example of street design, but they actually did a pretty good job on this one. The cities of Lancaster and Palmdale are actually looking over the next decade at potential bus rapid transit approaches. This is one of the better ones that I've seen. Dedicated bus rapid transit lanes in the middle of the street. Very nice for passengers. They only have to cross half of a street. And you have to make sure you get the land use right along with it. That's another component of complete streets. You can see on the right here, pretty good job by the developer of this shopping center. Someone walking from the stop, very easy access to that. On the left, not so much. They have a large parking lot to cross. The disturbing thing about this one is this happens to be the site of the transit agency in Nevada. So their own stop is difficult for them to reach, for people to reach their building from the stop that they created. The city has done some things on improving safety with complete streets, and sometimes it's not that elaborate. We've talked about what we did down on Valley Central Way, taking out a lane in each direction, putting in the bike lanes, and it's had the effect that we wanted. Our collision rate has dropped by half on the street. The speed has dropped by about 5 miles an hour. But the amazing thing is, even with all of that, the street is carrying about 10 to 15% more traffic than it did before. That's made the center owner happy, as you can imagine. Wider streets create more accidents and more collisions. There's a study that was done back in the 1990s using Longmont, Colorado, and found a very direct correlation between the width of a street and the number of collisions that occurred along it, and the number of injury collisions. The wider the street, the more collisions per mile that occur. So it is a bit of a tragic irony. If you make nice wide streets so that you can respond quickly to things, that wide street probably is there to respond to accidents and collisions caused to some extent by the street itself. Connectivity. We do want to create street systems that are better connected. It not only reduces the traffic flow on the so-called arterial streets in the city, it makes for better walking and bicycling environments. So what we're going to look at is trying to discourage this kind of approach in favor of more of this kind of approach. And this is kind of the classic way that cities and towns were designed for a long, long time. Another thing that those connected street systems do is that if you're walking, it allows you to get to far more places within a 5-minute time frame. This kind of shows how those street networks work if you have a 5-minute time to walk from that particular intersection. And you'll see that the well-connected systems here and here allow people a far greater range of movement in that 5 minutes than do, say, the typical sort of 1950s design here, or especially the more cul-de-sac and disconnected systems that we see there. San Luis Obispo, for those of you familiar, very good example of a very well-connected street system. The classic grid pattern, which allows for a lot of very, very good connection and movement to happen. And we get kind of the poorly connected system, which is more typical that we see in our more modern suburban environment. This, I'm not really picking on Rancho Vista, but this is a classic kind of situation. If you look closely, you'll see that this development and this development and this development and this development do not have any connection across here whatsoever. So everything here has to go out to these streets that are on the periphery. So if you happen to live here and you have a friend that lives there, you probably will drive to find them, because there is no effective way for you to walk one way to the other. And that's something that we want to take a close look at as we move through this, is how we can avoid these kinds of situations. The final thing I really want to talk about is the idea of streets as a creator of value. This is Chuck Marone. He is the head of a organization known as Strong Towns. We do a lot of reading about his particular from his particular blog. He's a civil engineer by training. He's also holds a planning certification, and he really has delved into this whole issue of cost of streets, cost of maintenance, and what return that they have. And what really kind of triggered it for him was he took a look. Brainerd, Minnesota is his hometown, and he looked at what Front Street in Brainerd was like in 1894 and what that very same street is like today. And he said, I don't understand how we ever let this get away from us in Brainerd. He said, for a developed area that doesn't return nearly the same amount of value. And so he started from that point and started looking very closely at how street design influences the value of property along it. We had our own example. If we go back to that early 1920s development here, Lancaster Boulevard was a very productive street. But by 2010, that street was actually a repelling investment. People didn't want to be along it. And so that's what we want to avoid as we go through our street design efforts. And we did. We fixed this one. And that's what happened on the boulevard. This really does represent a pretty significant change of direction. But we think it's one that has to happen. We've already started with our master plan of trails and bikeways, our safe routes to school efforts, and we want to build on that in our complete streets plan. So I think this phrase is really true. The most dangerous thing that we can say is we've always done it this way, and I think it's time to say we may have always done it that way, but maybe we don't do it that way anymore. So that's really the kind of approach that we want to take for complete streets. As the commission, you're going to have involvement in this, and we'll look at some additional discussion as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ludicky. There may be a question or two. Go ahead and sit down. Go ahead, if anyone has any comments or questions.
What do you think caused the move to the high speed and the cul-de-sac type of thing? Was it the rise of the car or personal transportation?
I think there are a number of things, but I think the most important one is that engineering and design professionals, given a direction, will achieve what you ask them to achieve. And I think what they were asked is, seems to be a lot of congestion, can you move the traffic more quickly? And they said, well, sure we can. Here's the ways that we can do that. And I think and I think the Rancho Vista example was really good. They're not unique in this sense. But as you got streets that were less and less desirable to be along, either because of noise, amount of traffic, speed of traffic, you see development starting to wall itself off and trying to separate itself from those places. So I don't think anyone set out to really create problems, But one of the great things about design professions is that you should be able to go back and evaluate what's happened and see whether you need to adjust. And we're saying that in some cases, yes, we need to look at an adjustment to that. The other thing that I think, and our city engineer, Michelle Cantrell, kind of did a good job of highlighting this for me. She says, think about what cars were like in the 50s and 60s, she says, or even the 70s, when you tried to drive them at high speed.
You got tickets.
You got tickets. They weren't all that comfortable. They could be noisy. But think about cars now and vehicles now and how they're designed and how quickly you could move and not even seem that you're moving that quickly. So we've had a great leap forward in technology in terms of making rides smooth and comfortable and so forth. But at the same time, as I mentioned, we made driving more and more automatic. And the problem with that is that if people don't feel they have to be aware, they're not aware, or they'll replace that with other forms of risky behavior because they think it's safe. We have all kinds of rules that you're not supposed to be using these on the road. But if people feel that the road is safe enough and there's no real issue, guess what? They're going to assume the amount of risk that they think they can. One of the greatest conversations that I had was shortly after the city opened the redone boulevard, and I talked to a very pleasant lady who said she enjoyed coming to the boulevard, but she didn't like driving here because she, quote, had to think too much when she drove, unquote. And, I kind of laughed at that at first, but then I thought, hey, she's probably got a point, In the rest of the city, she considers it automatic. Here, she has to pay attention to people backing out of parking spaces, pedestrians crossing, people on bicycles, and by and large, those things don't exist in other parts of the city because we've kind of worked them out through the design. So I think that, ironically, part of making streets safer is to have to force people to be more aware of what's going on. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's a lot of things about traffic engineering I'm learning are very counterintuitive.
What would you do, like on an intersection like K and 30th West, where we have huge amounts of traffic around the college? How would you approach making that a complete street?
I think that, and the city, interestingly, is looking at that location. There are things you can do with curb extensions. We have talked about whether there's really the need for all of the lanes of traffic that go. We've looked at whether or not there are ways to, through the use of medians or other kinds of visual obstacles, so to speak, tell people that as they're approaching, it's an area they have to slow down because something different is happening. Something I just learned the other day is that one of the techniques that traffic engineers are using in rural areas where they're replacing four-way intersections with roundabouts is they actually will intentionally bend the road so that people approaching it are aware that there's a movement in the road, they have to slow down, and it tells them that things are not the same ahead as they were behind. So the next time you drive, think about what the visual clues tell you. On the boulevard, everything from the trees to the shadows to the narrowness kind of sends you a message about how you ought to behave or drive in that location. And then think about what it's like out on a stretch where you don't have those restrictions and you feel a lot more comfortable driving a lot more quickly. And, that's the reason that you could go out to, a place like 30th Street West and put a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit sign, and it absolutely has no effect and makes no sense because people, psychologically are saying, I know that's not right. I know that's not true. So,
Mr. Luedecke, since there are a number of projects in that have been approved by this commission through the years, yet have set fallow, if you will, for various reasons, whether it's economic, whether it's whatever it may be, including residential and commercial, and primarily residential and commercial. What opportunity, if any, will we have to rethink those street patterns, particularly the current high-speed thoroughfares adjacent to major commercial development?
In some cases, the city itself is looking at things it can do. There are going to be areas where the city right-sizes the roadway to try to get some safety benefit back or some slowdown. You saw, for instance, on Valley Central. In cases where you have an approved project but somebody wants to change that, we had an example of that just at your last meeting. We had a development on a site that actually had an approved, pretty standard, typical tract map that had the same width for the roadways on, I believe, 25th East and Avenue J8. But as part of that redesign, the city said, no, we want you to face towards those two streets. We're going to reduce the width of those streets. We're going to put the roundabout at the intersection. And we're going to start rethinking how that stretch of road goes. So retrofit is always difficult. New development, as we've done in some places on 65th Street West and J8, where we required the roundabout and a different approach in those locations also. We're going to do those changes where we can. But what we're really hoping to find out through the Complete Streets effort is what changes we can actually make in street design to achieve more target speeds within our city. We're really concerned about the 45, 50 mile an hour speeds that we have in large parts of our developed area, because those have a lot of effect on the value of property along them, the ability for school children and elderly, some of our most vulnerable residents, to cross. They're not people in some cases who have the ability to drive. We're looking at trying to make sure that the long-term maintenance cost for the city has a better match to what the revenue generation is from the area that the street serves. That's a particular point of concern also. So we have all of these factors that we want to look at, and like anything, it's going to take not simply a change of a plan, but kind of a change in the way we look at things. In that regard, I mentioned some of the legal changes that were coming. Another one that's going to be, I think, very significant is the state legislature passed a bill this past year that under the California Environmental Quality Act, a change in the level of service of traffic will no longer be considered a significant effect. So now that was done primarily to encourage infill-type projects, but its effects are potentially far-reaching as cities start looking at things other than just how quickly you can move traffic. And to show you how one-dimensional that measure level of service can be, if you have a level of service A and you have some people from the senior center crossing the road or people crossing, that level of service can suddenly drop to B or C. So what we're trying to do is look at what are now called multimodal levels of service, which really look at how well the street serves all the potential users as far as safety is concerned. I know we all get concerned about how quickly we can get down a roadway, but if you start doing some calculating and looking, you'll find that the amount of time saved is sometimes no more than 30 seconds to a minute on a stretch of roadway. And so we really need to kind of balance, that time saved versus what are the other community benefits that we get.
So it leads me to the question of an example of an intersection that, to me, doesn't meet the definition 10th Street, West Avenue, L. The dedications there and the width of the street, and particularly at the intersection, certainly there's certainly a lot of wasted space. And within that sphere, you have primary commercial, you have a park, you have apartments, you have a large medical center, plus commercial developments. So you've really got the mix you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to do it over again, the street pattern design would be somewhat different, no doubt.
Yes, if we were starting from scratch, I think we would look at it differently. I think we would look at...
So if you take intersections that have approved projects with similar street pattern dedications that we required
Mm-hmm.
some years ago, wouldn't it be, considering that it doesn't trigger CEQA, if I understand you correctly?
Yeah, level of service changes may not.
So maybe that would be worth evaluating before folks start pulling permits, which would be nice to see if they would. But to me, it creates a safer environment for everyone, but also gives the city the opportunity to generate more yield on the commercial sites, which generates more taxes, which benefits the city overall, as far as the city government is concerned.
Yes, and
potentially.
Yes, and I'll give you one final thought. We have talked at times about when we were going to take up the commercial zoning regulations and design regulations. And one of the reasons that I've wanted not to do that immediately is this very issue of these complete streets, because depending on the way we go with those, we may want to rethink how our commercial layout and our requirements stack up, just to address the very issue you're talking about. And maybe there are ways to get greater yield, which...
That's a secondary benefit.
Yeah.
I mean, the primary benefit is a safer environment, safer streets, safer citizens. It's somewhat really secondary, but the opportunity is there, and particularly in neighborhoods that have mixed uses, schools, parks, residential development, and these commercial nodes that are in the general plan with zoning in place. Some have projects, some don't. Whether it be on the east side or the west side, or projects that have expired or whatever. I mean, it seems to me it would be an ample opportunity for us to really dig into it and make some inroads.
I would agree with that.
Anyone else have any comments?
I'd like to say thank you for that presentation. It definitely opened your eyes and give you something to think about.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ludick. All right, and continued business is the temporary promotional signs and banners matter. And we have a presentation and a handout as well. Mr. Ludick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we discussed, we're trying to kind of get some of the groundwork set for the direction to go on a draft ordinance. It's going to take us a little bit of time to go through that. But what we'd really like to do this evening, we're kind of building on the discussion that you had at your last regular meeting, is we want to try to get some idea from the commission as a group which sorts of approaches when it comes to temporary signage you'd be willing to consider. And we have some individual questions, as far as this type of sign, include it, don't include it. And we also want to talk to you about the overall approach, one sort of overarching question, which is how we ought to structure the ordinance itself. And I guess, as I said, we're really trying to just set these basic boundaries and parameters at this point. We talked about and we looked at pictures of a lot of different types of signs. And one of the things that we would like to hear from the Commission, your thoughts. Staff feels, because the direction has been to create a sensible ordinance, however we ultimately define that. One of the things that we think might go well towards that end is, rather than establishing a set of requirements that say, if you're a business, you get this, and that's what you get. We were wondering whether the Commission was willing to look at an ordinance that would be drafted to say, here are 4 options, 5 options for temporary signage. You can pick, 2 of 5 to have, and within each of those there's, we have standards for how big they can be, where they can be located, how they can be placed on the property. I guess that's a repeat of what I already said, and how many days per year you can do this, as opposed to kind of the current thing, which says you can have X amount in windows. You can have a banner for X number of days. So I guess the first question, before we kind of start looking at these individual ones, is what's the Commission's feeling on that kind of an approach? Do you think that that's one that we should look at, or would you prefer to just go to one that kind of says, here are the ways we're going to allow you, and that's it?
It seems like it would be more sensible to have a menu. That way we can allow our business to pick their own signage, and it would be their choice. If we have a set of requirements, then it'll be that bad city is telling me I can't have this. And with the menu, I think we could allow, like you said, you can pick 2 of 5 for temporary.
Have you defined what temporary signs are yet?
Yeah, I was going to ask that too. Is what is temporary?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we would have to define.
And what sensible is?
Temporary signs. Yes, sensible, I'm going to say, will be the totality of whatever draft ordinance you ultimately recommend, because I know you're all sensible people.
That's good. So did you learn to slow dance and polka at the same time?
I don't even quite know what that means.
Oh, you don't understand
actually.
The question. Okay.
No.
Oktoberfest.
I liked your answer, Brian. That was great. Thank you. So, establishing definitions of what temporary signs are, and then what categories. I mean, you have to define. You come up with what, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of them here. So what's everybody else's doing?
Yeah, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, we've got 7 basic categories, but I guess what we need to know from our standpoint is the Commission's thought on this idea of a menu of options for commercial business owners.
And we're only discussing temporary signs in a commercial setting.
Yes. That's all we were asked to address.
Right.
So wouldn't include subdivision sales or real estate. We're looking at stuff related to commercial business. Now,
Not industrial?
I'm going to hold that off for the time being. We haven't given a lot of thought to that at this point.
You do have some uses in industrial which tend to be commercial that
Yeah, depending on location, they may be.
Yeah, would necessarily be, quote, regulated by So for instance, if you had a banner in a non-commercial zone location, we define, for instance, a banner has a certain dimension, has a certain copy, has a certain whatever. We may define that, a certain time limit. For instance, if a banner is being placed in lieu of a permanent sign.
Yeah, and that comes back also to the issue of temporary. You know, what's a temporary sign?
So if we define that in a commercial setting, but ignore the industrial land use areas, then we are double speaking, aren't we?
Yeah, there's that potential. I don't think we've really thought, at least I haven't, beyond the idea of just commercial business, but certainly there are industrially zoned areas of the city that contain businesses that operate far more as a commercial business than they do what you would call your classic industrial location.
And often have what I would define as temporary signage that becomes permanent. So, at least from my chair, I think that should be part of the scope of what we're looking at. Somehow, I mean, if the consensus is to control banners that are temporary in nature in lieu of permanent signage, we should apply the same standard in other jurisdictions. At least that's my feeling about it. And I think we've seen applicants come before us, and 6 months later, a year later, you go by and the banner's still up, but it's all tattered.
So, definition of a temporary sign is any sign that is not permitted.
That's not what?
Permanent.
Permanent.
Maybe.
I don't know. We'll look at how that goes. I think in concept, yes, but legal definitions can be tricky. That's why we have the assistant city attorney to help us on this matter.
Thank you.
So you're not going on record, Ms. Corwood, but you will let us know the next time we probably get together what an appropriate draft definition might be?
Of temporary or banner, or both?
Well, whatever we discuss. Temporary for a start.
Certainly.
Sensible. Leave that alone.
I would like to say in developing the definition of temporary for purposes of what we were instructed to look at, I think we're also going to need to have conversation about what doesn't constitute a temporary sign. We were looking at some of those fast food with the permanent frame on the wall and so forth. At some point, we're probably going to need to rope that in too and determine whether that does or does not constitute temporary. We kind of have to figure out what the globe that we're talking about, and then whatever does not apply in there. And then that will help us, I think, get a better sense of an overall definition of temporary.
So that what you're describing, the typical freestanding fast food operator with a permanent sign frame embedded in the stucco or other facade that has a changeable copy, may not necessarily be temporary. However, the copy's temporary.
Correct. And at least right now, I believe that the city's code reads something to the effect of any permitted sign can be a changeable copy sign.
However, any permitted sign that you want to change copy under the current code, you still have to come back through a review. For instance, if you're changing the signage on your business from the XYZ food store to the ABC fast food, wouldn't they?
Yeah, for something like that, yes. But what I'm thinking of, too, is we don't have a lot of them in town, but we have a few. I think about the old-style signs where you can slide the letters in, so to speak. I think Oxford Inn, Marie Callender's, I think, still may have one.
Hand sign.
Yeah. Yeah, it's considered sign. It's counted as sign area. It's changeable copy, though.
Sort of a marquee.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of those now are going to electronic, where they can change the copy on them.
Are we
But
going
we're
to...
not addressing that, excuse me. We're not addressing changeable copy sign.
No, that's not really our intent, but it may be a side discussion that you may need to have as you look at this issue of things that we might normally consider temporary signs but are placed in a way that they're kind of in a permanent sign location, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Go ahead, Brandy, I'm sorry.
On the industrial that Chairman Bowes brought up, we are going to include that with this, or are we going to, because we weren't instructed to do it, we're just instructed to base the commercial, but I think we'll be ending up looking at it in the future. Wouldn't it just be easier now to handle that?
It may be. Like I said, it's not something that I've given a lot of thought to at this point, but I think the difficulty there would be trying to figure out how you address the distinction, and I'm not prepared to give an answer to it. The distinction between a commercial business operating in an industrial location versus an industrial business operating in an industrial location, and maybe we don't care. Maybe there's no need to create that distinction. But right now, our code differentiates signage in many cases by zone classification.
So once you decide what the definition of a temporary sign is, once we decide what that is, then we have to decide what as described and given in our handout here. These are likely temporary signs. Banners are likely temporary. However, some are permanent, at least from my own observation. Been there a while. Gives me the sense they're permanent.
Right. So, and that's an interesting part of the discussion. It may come out that you say, hey, banners are not permanent signage. You can't have them as permanent signage. I'm not suggesting one way or the other. I'm just saying that may be one of the decisions you have to ponder.
So define banners.
Well, we're not to that point yet. We can show you some pictures, which we intend to do.
Could that be a definition? We know if we see it?
Actually, one of the internal discussions that we have had regarding these things is that we want to have pictures as a part of the code, as a guide to what we mean when we say a teardrop banner or a whatever may be the thing.
So if you go online to the national companies who produce temporary signs, and you'll have some depiction of what those might be. That might be a beginning point.
Yes, actually, I think Jocelyn has gone online to look at some of the temporary signage that's available.
I did actually. I was looking especially at those, they're called teardrops, they're called rain banners. I can't remember. There were like 4 or 5 different names just on a quick Google search. So if we're not all clear that we're talking about the same tangible thing, we're dead in the water before we even start. So I think for purposes of maybe looking at these photos and saying yay or nay, if we get an idea that you're comfortable with the idea of banners purely as temporary, and then we can drill down and get into some of the particulars. Let's limit what kind of materials maybe you want us to use, the method you're going to affix it to the wall, etc. But if we get a sense of the main categories, then we can really then start dealing with the specifics of each one. There's not a lot of point, it seems to me, to have a long discussion about a category that you actually decide you don't want to have at all as an option. Just a thought.
Well, would we not agree, all of us, that banners are a fact of life in retail marketing? And, we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot.
Well,
It's not an unreasonable, to me, it's not an unreasonable
yeah, and that's really the kind of determinations that we need you to come to. Do you want banners included as an allowable type of temporary sign? But I don't know. Have we determined whether you guys want to go this menu approach or not?
You mean the one from column A and two from column B and that?
Yeah.
I'll reserve my opinion on that.
You'll reserve your opinion? Any opinions from the remaining commissioners, or would you like to kind of go through the types?
I like the menu idea.
I have a question. Thousand Oaks, I've heard they don't do signage, right? I think for the most part in their city, they have a very strict
restrictive
restriction. But are they still considered friendly to the business? And do we know, by them being so strict, does it hurt business attracting customers? Does anybody know those answers?
I don't know the answer.
Because I noticed driving around the Antelope Valley, I noticed different parts of town, their signs look clean and crisp and inviting maybe to go to that business. I noticed other businesses, it looks shoddy, cluttered, disarrayed, and very cheap. So it has a different impact depending which roads I'm traveling on. And so I was curious about the Thousand Oaks by that strict guideline, if they're still considered business-friendly, and if it hurts the businesses by them being so strict. So I don't know if you can get any information on that or not.
We can take a look at their code as to what they do as far as temporary signage and give you a report back.
0.
I'd also throw in, I can certainly try to contact some people at Thousand Oaks. I used to represent them at one point. I don't know if I still know people there, but I'm perfectly happy to make some phone calls and try to find a person who could answer that. Have they found that it's helped since they adopted these stricter standards? Are they getting good feedback or what? Let me see what I can find for you.
I have some anecdotal comments about Thousand Oaks, but I'll reserve those as well. What do you guys think about banners?
Well, I think a time limit on banners would be great. That would fit into our temporary sign, because with our gentle winds that we have around here, a banner looks very shoddy after no time at all. So it, by its very design, should be temporary.
One of the things I'd wonder about, through the years, the method of creation of temporary signs. The material used, the copy, those kinds of things have changed over the years. I guess the hot ticket now is a vinyl material, which is used on billboards primarily now, and a lot of temporary sign, I think. So I think we have to be careful when we define temporary and the type of material and copy and all, if we get that far, or even have to be aware of limiting ourselves.
I think once we get a sense from this evening's discussion which of these categories you want to explore further, then we can go back and kind of survey some more of the specifics, and maybe some of the manufacturers as well, just trying to get some basic specs that you can evaluate and decide what works here.
Is there,
Once a month I get a a thick brochure about signs in my mailbox. I imagine you probably do too, Fabian. You don't get them? I do. Yeah, so next time I get one, instead of putting it in the file cabinet at the post office, I'll share it with you. So, banners?
I think finding temporary signs, what a temporary sign is, the different categories of temporary signs, getting down to the materials, and I don't know if that's kind of overkill or not, but I do think a menu type option for businesses to choose wall-mounted banner, window, how much window space we're going to allow them. It's a big task to take on, and not to make it overkill, but kind of keep it simple. I hope we can accomplish that.
Yeah, I think I agree. Banner should be under short term, probably 30 to 60 days. Because after that 60 days, they get, the material, looks bad, pretty bad. So I think should be a short term. And I like the menu option.
All right, thank you. Anyone else want to offer anything?
And then just one
Go ahead.
last comment. Taking into account the industrial, I do think the commercial and the industrial, we kind of do need to take that into consideration.
Okay.
And when you say commercial, in my mind, we're assuming specific plan areas.
Yes, unless, some specific plan areas have their own requirements already, but, yeah.
For everything from landscaping to signage to setback and all
Right.
the rest of it. Whether it's enforced or not, it's another question, however.
Is there any data available how temporary signs drive business? Is there...
Oh, I'm sure temporary sign manufacturers can provide you all kinds of stuff. But I personally have never seen anything. But I'm sure it's out there. The internet probably has got a wealth of information on that.
So we think we know what a temporary sign is, in my mind. I think I know. Not sure I could define it. So what, the seven examples that you've given us?
Yeah, we tried to define these as categories,
All right.
and what we're really trying to figure out is as a commission, are there any of these that you, quite frankly, would not want to allow in any way, shape, or form as temporary signage? And if that is the case, then we're going to set those aside and not bother to do any more research or discussion on those. And we'll focus on the ones that you think should be a part of the temporary sign package.
I personally don't really like the inflatables at all, the inflatable signs.
I don't hear any disagreement. So the skinny tire guy or whatever he is, or the skinny carpet guy, or I'm not sure what he is. Maybe it's a she, I don't know.
Okay, so is that a consensus, no inflatables?
I think so.
Thank you.
Let's start with banners. I think everybody has touched on banners as being an appropriate use in some situation.
Okay, so they can reasonably be part of a temporary sign
Could
mix.
be.
I think that defines what a temporary sign is a teardrop banner. It just screams, I'm temporary.
So what is the opinion on the teardrop banners from the commission's standpoint? Is this one you want to look at including, recognizing that we haven't and discussed yet what we have in the way of location or other kinds of restrictions? Is it one you want to look at the possibility as an option?
I think they definitely need to be included. They appeared to be the latest and greatest in advertising.
I think it's a good idea to
Yeah.
include it.
They are effective, so.
Notwithstanding the measurement of the effectiveness of any temporary sign. And that's just, to me, a blanket statement, because if you have marquee sign, street frontage sign, permanent, and permanent building sign, what's the benefit of 2 or 3 teardrop banners in a location that has those 3 that I mentioned?
I think it's the color.
Pardon?
I think what grabs people's attention, whether I like them or not like them, I think it's the color and it grabs your attention.
So-
Because I think that the permanent signs affixed to the building, you become very accustomed to them because they are permanent. So if you're changing these out with either design or color, I think that's what makes you kind of look for a second.
I agree with
Or
that.
safe streets?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I used to have a Quiznos sub, and then every time we had a promotion, they were effective. So we weren't doing like all the time, but like some like in the weekends and like certain days I had those promotions, so I put it up. It does affect, and it takes people's attention, and people come in. So I definitely in favor of that. It doesn't have to be all through the whole year, but like temporary. So.
And if I could add, something like the teardrop banner, which to me, at least, speaking only for myself, feels very, very temporary, very much like a weekend promotional thing. So when we start talking about duration of time and the number of times a year, teardrop banners might be one that has a very small window as opposed to a banner that could be up there for 30 days, for example. So that could be one way for us to kind of keep better tabs on those, and also to avoid people using those in lieu of permanent signage, which I think we've seen plenty of examples of.
Okay. Anything more on the teardrop banners? That's a separate category, if you will, then, huh? Potentially.
Yes,
Would
I
everyone
think so.
agree that's a separate category?
I think we would lose people if we had banners and then didn't separate teardrop banner out, because it's 2 different things, even though they have the same name.
Right.
I think a teardrop is meant to grab your attention. I think a banner is meant to give you a message.
So there is the potential of some temporary signs of being distractive and maybe not in very good taste. And I don't know how you put that in a definition or regulation, but good luck.
I don't know how I do that either, but we'll figure it out.
Or even if we even want to try. Okay. Are we ready to move to the next one? Flags and pennants?
Yeah, and we used the term flags and pennants to try to define the things that are strung and
Like you
I
might
guess-
see in a car dealership or...
right.
Like that.
Flags are included in that. The idea of these flags, you tend to see those more with home sales, which we're really not discussing here, but they do pop up on occasion for commercial.
Well, given our occasional breeze in the high desert, we may want to consider the flags and pennants in a like in the teardrop banner category to some degree, because they don't last long depending on the material used. I think our current regulations do not allow them in under any circumstances in commercial.
No, with the exception of, I believe, car dealerships,
Right.
auto sales.
So this new ordinance will allow them in commercial?
Only if you choose to allow them. Well, ultimately, if the council chooses to allow them. But in terms of your recommendation, that's what we're trying to understand. Is that a category of a type of temporary sign that you want to allow, or one that you don't want to include as allowed?
It would have a short duration, similar to the teardrop banner, and it could easily be a menu choice. I hate to limit businesses' choice on what they want to do.
I disagree. I don't think they belong anywhere in our city. Probably including car dealers, but you see them in used car lots. And that's a high revenue generator and sales tax for the city, so I'll be quiet.
If I can interject, something that you might also want to consider, because we do encounter this, when people put up banners, like for grand openings, like in a shopping center, they'll put the banner along with the flags and pennants. So if we're going to make the pennants and flags more restrictive as far as time, how is that going to work with the banners? How will we be able to enforce that, since we have two different types of signs, temporary signs with different time limits on it?
Well,
Right, but they choose both, so you choose a banner and you choose a flag.
if we combine the teardrop banners with the flag and pennants, we can call the teardrop banners labeled now as teardrop pennants, because I think when they market them, that's actually how they're sold.
No, I understand that. What I'm saying is that if someone chooses from a menu that they can have banners, which is, it appears that we're going to allow banners to be up a little bit longer than the teardrops and the flags and pennants,
Maybe.
that maybe, that's something we might want to look at, that if we're going to separate the amount of time you can have each, situations where we do have shopping centers that will have banners and the flags, if in reality they are going to want to take the flags out because that's going to be a little bit more visible than just a banner, because the banners could be in the building. Most of these buildings are set back further. They string these pennants on the light posts and things like that. So something that we might want to consider, you might want to consider thinking about in allowing that at the same time with different time limits. So how would that be enforced when our staff goes out?
Well,
I think where
speaking
the
of,
menu option comes in, that would be a great place to...
Then you have to
Opportunity to
define
enforce
where
it.
on the site they could be located,
True.
depending on the
But
conformance of the site, whether it's got outbuildings, outpads or not. I mean,
yeah.
it really gets complicated.
True. So I think the core issue, before we can get to that, is pennants and flags, something you want to include as part of the mix or not. I've heard one yes, one no, and kind of waiting.
I think you've heard two yeses.
Did I hear a second yes?
Was the menu option?
Yeah.
Flags,
Menu
pennants as a menu
I
option.
did say I agree with that.
Okay, two.
I strongly disagree for the third time. Cheapens the look of the community. And I think you will agree with that eventually when you see the menu that is going to be offered to you. But again, until we get the menu, who knows? So we're open to discuss anything.
We're open to discuss that one.
You bet.
Okay.
I think window signs, obviously, I mean, there's no objection to window signs, is there?
no,
I mean, as a potential menu item.
we already have an ordinance on how much the windows they can cover.
There are those requirements for purely temporary purposes we can have different standards than are set for permanent window signage, and I think it would be appropriate to have different standards. So as we move through the process, those can be some of the questions that we discuss: size, limits for a temporary duration, etc.
So we're talking about temporary window signs. Would we also include in that seasonal signs, the hand-painted temporary seasonal window sign?
Yeah, I think they're called out sort of separately right now, but we'll take a look at how those kind of fit within the overall time frame.
And one thing that we could do, if you, as we move through this process, if you decide that you expressly don't want holiday-type window displays to be considered temporary signage, that's your choice too. I don't have an opinion one way or the other, but it's something to discuss, sort of as we did with some of the carnival things that weren't carnivals.
I certainly don't want to dampen somebody's holiday spirit, but
Assuming you mean like Christmas?
Thanksgiving, Halloween,
Really?
Easter,
I thought those were just holidays.
not the holiday.
Well, you know, we don't want to get into the political correctness of definitions here, so. However, when you address signs, you're going to have to give examples, and I guess you could call them holiday signs and get by with it. Am I giving you a headache yet, Brian?
I'll say this, as I've said to my staff, signs in general give me a headache when it comes to discussing these things. But in terms of holiday signs, holiday stuff, one approach, and we can look at it, is rather than defining which holidays you can have signs for and which ones you can't, you might just establish a set of days that say, regardless of when the holiday falls or what it is, this is the total aggregate number of days you can have that are holiday signs.
That may get us around it. So, window signs are, there's no objection in concept to window sign,
No.
right? In-ground mounted wire or metal post sign. Temporary in nature, right?
Yeah, these tend to be those things that you see stuck particularly into landscaped areas, and I think last time, in fact, some of it is here, we did have several pictures of those showing a considerable number at times.
All right.
So the question, do you want those to be considered as part of what the mix of temporary signage can be?
Suppose so.
I think so.
I think it needs to be.
Yeah. And the last one on page 2 is pole lamp post sign, which are very prevalent on the boulevard.
Yes.
They must be good then.
You'll remember that one of the photos, or one of the sets of photos that we saw at the last meeting, showed a swath of a parking lot that had every single lamppost had signs, and I think it was Carl's Jr. or some fast food thing, and it was plastered everywhere, so something to consider.
Right, in a controlled shopping center environment. So, well, probably worth considering, but
The only thing that I don't see on our examples here is sidewalk signs, those sandwich board A-frames.
A-frames, that sort of thing, yeah.
That could fall under your wire metal post signs,
Or a separate category.
the A-frame sandwich board.
Yeah. I think we'd probably want to take that up separately. Because it gets, I mean, those typically go in and out at the end of, beginning of business, end of business, that day and that sort of stuff, where the in-ground mounted wire and metal post signs tend to be longer duration.
In regard to the A-frame signs, they're actually prohibited in our city,
Right.
other than the downtown.
Right. So the consensus is the pole lamppost signs need to be looked at. Right?
Yes.
You can always X them out.
You could take a look at them. Some of the drive-throughs are getting absolutely cluttered.
Yeah. So, our 10-minute discussion lasted slightly longer than 10 minutes. Isn't that right? Wasn't that, Commissioner Traciano, wasn't that, didn't we, oh, I didn't. I thought I had decided that the chair's prerogative to limit our discussion to 10 minutes, but I forgot to mention it, so we did have a thorough discussion. You all have enough to work on, do you think?
Let's recap so that we understand. The commission is open to a menu-type approach for the ordinance.
Some members are, yes.
Okay. As a consensus or as a majority, we'll assume that. And the only category of sign that I heard as an absolute no was the inflatable type sign. And we heard A-frames added. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Will that rewrite the normal code then on the A-frame sign if it's already illegal?
If you allow it as a form of temporary sign, yes, it would. The same way that there's a current restriction on tenants and so forth, except for car or automobile dealerships, yes, it would change those provisions of the code.
And we could kind of do a workaround on that. I think we might have done something like that with the carnival, just a default catch-all provision that says notwithstanding any other provision of the code for purposes of temporary, A-frame is permissible or what have you, so that we're not having to rewrite every code section that refers to A-frames.
So for an example, using the boulevard as an example with lots of pedestrian traffic, slow vehicle speeds, landscaping, parking, all those kinds of considerations, plus a downtown, in our case, there's a maintenance agreement and a downtown business association that manages all that stuff, right? The alternative may be that A-frames on the public sidewalk in other locations may not be an appropriate location for them because they impede pedestrian traffic, and the business operator is set back, for instance, from the sidewalk, and the traffic speed is high, and they have little effect, potentially. Or they may be suitable. I don't know, but I think we ought to look at them.
It brings to mind the one on Trevor and I, the guy with the mattress store would always have his little A-frame out there, and he'd go, thank you for the firefighters or something like that. I think that falls under the A-frame, and it kind of became kind of like a little landmark. I'd drive by just to see what he had to say, or when I was there, I'd make sure I looked at it. But the way it's currently written, he can't have it.
Did you buy any mattresses?
No, I never went in a store.
There you go. Anything else you want to clarify, Mr. Ludicky?
No, I think we have quite a bit of work cut out for us starting to look at this. Thank you.
So we expect to have something back for another brief discussion next month?
All I will promise you is there will be some sort of issues for you to discuss at your next meeting as we start to craft this.
And I will make every effort to have some feedback for you, Commissioner Cook, on your question about the strict regulations that have been enforced in Thousand Oaks.
I spent a lot of time in Newbury Park and Thousand Oaks over the last number of years. And as I recall, you could probably count on one hand commercial development opportunities in the community other than a tear down. And the street patterns, medians, landscaping requirements that impact commercial development are such that the commercial development's facade sign, if you will, their can sign or their identifier, does not face any public thoroughfare. That'd be about right?
I really don't recall. I'm going to have to refresh my memory, but I would not be surprised if that were the case.
Right. That is, at least from my personal shopping experience, in a whole lot of places in Thousand Oaks.
But did you have a hard time finding where you wanted to go without signage directing you in?
Yeah, I suppose if you use Google Map, you can find some of these things, but if you're not familiar with the retailer, it's very challenging. And then turning movements are also very challenging. So if you're going east and west on a street and you want to access a certain business, you can't get there from here. So I can't imagine this community ever considering that kind of structure. But you have to understand that Thousand Oaks is they don't issue building permits. There's nothing being built there, rarely. And new development, for the most part, is turned down, even if it's on a zoned property with the general plan already in place. I mean, that's just their attitude.
I said that's interesting.
It is, yeah. It's very difficult to get a permit even on property that has the appropriate land use. Not that it's impossible, but it's very, very, very challenging. If you measured by the County of Los Angeles, the County of Los Angeles would be considered easy compared to the City of Thousand Oaks. And I can guarantee you it takes a while in the County of Los Angeles.
And I have to say, I think aside from the large Thousand Oaks Mall, I don't know that I ever got the sense that Thousand Oaks really wanted outsiders coming into their commercial areas anyway, and so why make it easy for outsiders? If you live there, theoretically you know where you're going, and the rest of us are out of luck.
You know which side street to take and where to turn right and where to turn left, and they have plenty of law enforcement to adjust your attitude if you make a wrong turn. So that's only an anecdotal comment, though, however. Director's announcements, Mr. Ludicky.
None at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Commission agenda. You guys have an update on your efforts?
That was presented to City Council last week, and Robert Neal did a very nice job in showing what we were up to with the Better Built Home programs, another menu type of option. So the sign ordinance and the LED ordinance are following this. Let our people pick their own poison type of thing. The mayor did say one thing very interesting to me, and he said, you're not here to follow guidelines, you're here to break them. And I found that very challenging. And Fabian was there with me, and I really leaned on him pretty heavily that night.
Very good. Anyone else have anything to add? Well, thank you for your efforts, and we expect to have that brought to closure this year.
It seems to keep growing. It's like a thing in a petri dish. We're not 100% sure whether it's going to be penicillin or it's going to be the next plague.
Oh, my.
Just to comment on that.
Go ahead.
I think that's going to be a good program. We're going to be able to reduce our carbon footprint by giving the builders and even owner-builder the opportunity to enhance their properties with energy-saving features and get a discount on their permit. So it's not something that we're forcing somebody to do. We're giving them the option if you want to do it. The city is willing to work with them on their impact fees.
It certainly is a cutting-edge idea, and it seems appropriate for our city, with being the first to require residential solar, to continue on in this path of trying to become the net zero city. So it's a really good idea for the future of our atmosphere and the type of environment we're going to leave our kids and grandkids. So I support that vision a lot. I think it's worthwhile.
I kind of cringed when I got asked to be in that working group. It started out with mandating LED lighting. Now, from the lighting, we've gone to water conservation, energy conservation and environmental conservation features, just from conversation of an LED light. So, city staff has been great to work with, and it's nice to see a program like this evolve.
Very good, thank you. Anything further from the commission? Nope. All right then. Since we have no public attending our meeting tonight, there's no point in announcing public business from the floor. So, without objection, then, we stand adjourned to our special meeting for agenda review Monday, November 10th, 2014, at 5:30 p.m. in the Public Safety Conference Room at City Hall. Thank you all for your participation.